Before sunrise on July 16, 1979, Navajos who resided in Church Rock, New Mexico, awoke to the sound of rushing water. They were confused, for there had been no rain to cause flooding of the nearby Puerco River. Unbeknownst to them, a nearby dam owned by United Nuclear had failed, releasing 95 million gallons of mine waste into the local water systems. This waste contained 1,100 tons of radioactive waste from a mill that processed uranium, killing sheep that drank it and burning the feet of children who waded in it. United Nuclear temporarily closed the mill, and immediately the Indian Health Services urged people not to drink the water, but without assistance many poor families had no other options. Shortly after, the CDC tested the radiation levels of just 6 people, and when their results weren't alarming, declared that no major threat to public health existed due to the spill. In spite of this, the Navajo Nation appealed to the state's governor to declare a state of emergency in the Church Rock area, a request that was denied. However, when United Nuclear threatened to start laying people off if the mill remained closed, the state and federal government quickly complied to let mill operations resume just 5 months after the massive spill. The spill, and effects from the mill's continued operation after, landed the Church Rock on the national priority list for Superfund sites in 1983. The neglect of Navajo lands is evident when one compares the response to another nuclear accident that happened just 4 months prior at 3 Mile Island in Pennsylvania. A partial nuclear meltdown led to the evacuation of 140,000 people and to the state declaring a state of emergency, even though the release of nuclear radiation was significantly less than at Church Rock. Many government-funded investigations were commissioned to understand the causes and the long-lasting effects of the accident in Pennsylvania, but such studies do not exist for the Navajo at Church Rock. The failure of United Nuclear's dam was no mystery. Cracks were reported in the 75-foot earthen structure nearly 2 years prior to the spill, but no action was taken. United Nuclear efforts to clean amounted to the removal of 3,500 tons of contaminated soil downstream, estimated to be just 1% of the total affected soil. The site's designation as a Superfund has hardly been effective at providing meaningful assistance. After 36 years as a Superfund, the EPA's website still reports today that groundwater contamination and the migration of contaminated groundwater is not stabilized. Many Navajos have long given up hope of government assistance. They have formed grassroots organizations like Eastern Navajo Dine Against Uranium Mining to prevent future mining operations and aid contaminated areas. In 2017, the NDOM discovered a small Navajo community was still using contaminated water to hydrate and bathe their livestock. They found hairless sheep and insides of cows that had turned yellow. The Navajo had to burn the sick animals to avoid further contamination. Even though there is a lack of scholarly investigation on the effects of the spill, the experiences of Navajo show the terrible consequences on local health. One Navajo remarked on the high cancer rates in the reservation, "That's why we drink. We think we won't live long." This has negative implications for the future Navajo, as one resident of Church Rock commented, "Our generation is afraid of having children. Cancer runs in our family, but it shouldn't." Americans generally don't view pollution positively, but the time of putting production and profits over human lives must end. The current presidential administration values economic potential over the environment and public health, a trend that does not bode well for the neglected Navajo. The Navajo Nation deserves the reparation that disasters like the Church Rock spill demand, as well as protection from future exploitation. Japan's Fukushima Prefecture has become a one-of-a-kind destination for tourists seeking to learn about the earthquake, tsunami, and nuclear power plant disaster that hit the area in March 2011, killing more than 18,000 people and triggering radiation leaks that forced 150,000 to flee. I've also visited multiple times, recording the gradual recovery of the prefecture, and touring venues such as the TEPCO Decommissioning Archive Center managed by Tokyo Electric Power Co. Holdings, which operated the now decommissioned Fukushima Daiichi nuclear plant damaged by the earthquake and tsunami. Facilities such as the Archive Center, the Great East Japan Earthquake and Nuclear Disaster Memorial Museum, managed by the prefecture, and the Iwaki 3.11 Memorial and Revitalization Museum, run by the nearby city of Iwaki, offer comprehensive resources for inquisitive visitors, from multilingual panels with maps, graphs and photographs to auditoriums playing video clips. But I have also come to value niche venues that add depth and resonance to the story of the Fukushima tragedy. One is a 2-story wooden warehouse, sitting humbly on a patch of open ground about 15 kilometers from the nuclear plant, in an area that temporarily became a ghost town after being evacuated. I encountered it by chance during a trip to Fukushima in July to report on the release into the ocean of water contaminated by radioactivity, part of the lengthy process of cleaning up the disaster site. In between speaking to local fishers and seafood businesses, I came across a local news report about a museum that had opened a few weeks earlier. The location was hard to find. But after circling twice around the block, I spotted a banner reading, "Our Memorial Museum," hanging over the entrance to a warehouse. Inside were 50 artworks inspired by the disaster, dominated by a striking wood carving created by a sculptor who lost his home. A barricade like those used to close off evacuation zones stood in front of a wall of paintings, while a row of delicate, softly colored shells accompanied by phrases such as, "Tritium, please don't release it," and, "Do our voices reach you?" loomed out of a display shelf. Toshihiro Kanehara, an artist from Gunma Prefecture, southwest of Fukushima, showed me his painting of an acquaintance's house, which had to be scrapped because it was located inside the evacuation zone and could not be maintained. "I painted it based on their recollections of how the home looked," he said, pointing to the ghostly lines of the dwelling. "I wanted to express the absolute absurdity of not being able to live in the place that matters to you." The black and white picture occupies an entire wall of the warehouse's first floor. "When I visited after March 11th, there weren't any colors," Kanehara said. "Everything was covered in dirt, and I felt monochrome emotionally, too." The museum's curator, Jun Nakasuji, told me that artists have held several such exhibitions since 2011, but he had long wanted to create a permanent home for disaster-related art. Nakasuji is also a photographer, known for works featuring Chernobyl, a Ukrainian city struck by a nuclear plant disaster in 1986. The public memorials operated by the prefectural government and TEPCO showcase the storyline that they want people to hear, Nakasuji said. But behind those stories are the many people who fell victim to or suffered from the incidents. I think we need to feature that too. Spotting the potential opportunity presented by visitors to the disaster site, Fukushima Prefecture has launched a Hope Tourism initiative aimed at helping participants to learn about the disaster and broader socio-economic problems such as population decline, Japan's aging society, and energy issues. The initiative has been a success, with a record 17,806 people visiting Fukushima under the program in the 12 months through March 2023, nearly double the previous year's total. There is growing demand among schools, companies, and public institutions, according to Fukushima Minpo, a local newspaper. Part of the attraction may be the program's name. Hope tourism sounds much more positive than dark tourism, the term generally used to describe travel to places associated with death and tragedy, such as war memorials and battle sites. Indeed, the program's official brochure notes, "We dare not use terms such as earthquake or disaster prevention learning to describe what we have learned from the facts and lessons of this disaster and the challenges it poses for revitalization." So far, the program is limited to flagship venues such as the TEPCO Archive Center and the official museums. But Fukushima Prefecture should take a look at the smaller venues that are beginning to offer an alternative perspective. Nakasuji's newly opened museum, for example, would widen and humanize tourists' interaction with a tragedy that is currently being told largely from the perspective of the authorities who were responsible for dealing with it. On a sunny warm September day in 1957, an explosion rocked the pleasant, leafy, closed nuclear city called Chelyabinsk 40. The city was one of 10 closed, nuclear cities in the USSR, known under the acronym, ZATO. Closed nuclear cities were well-supplied, comfortable, child-centered communities where workers received higher wages, better health care, housing, and educational opportunities for their children. To work in a ZATO, employees were vetted for their political reliability and medical health. They signed oaths of secrecy. The factory the workers at the closed city served made plutonium for Soviet nuclear weapons. The source of the September 29 blast was an underground storage tank at the Mayak plutonium production plant. The tank held highly radioactive waste which overheated and blew, belching up a 160-ton cement cap buried 24 feet underground and tossing it in the air. A column of radioactive dust and smoke rocketed skyward for a half-mile, which sent down a sooty fallout. The blast issued into the Earth's atmosphere 20 million curies. The plant leadership was out of town on that day. Later, they were located at the Moscow Circus. Northwest plans were in place for a nuclear emergency. Soldiers were sent in to clean up the blast. Prisoners in barracks living nearby were left in place. Several dozen people suffering radiation poisoning were rushed to the local hospital. Plutonium plant workers, as they heard rumors and saw fallout fall from the sky grew nervous. In the months that followed, 3,000 employees quit their top-secret and well-paid jobs and left. Plant managers spent 11 million rubles on public relations programs to assure residents of the city's safety. They also used the closed city's gates and security measures to bar contaminants from entering the city. They turned away vehicles at the city gates registering high levels of contamination. They also banned soldiers and temporary cleanup workers from entering the closed city. Those measures worked. Valuable employees ceased to leave, and ones who had left asked to return after they realized how hard it was to live outside the closed city, where stores were empty and services miserable. In the farmland surrounding Kyshtym, 40, however, the accident was less successfully liquidated. In the hours after the explosion, a thick cloud of radioactive gas spread 2 million curies of radioactivity onto neighboring farmland, leaving a trace of contaminated territory 4 miles wide and 30 miles long. The fallout blanketed the territory where farmers in 87 villages were harvesting the year's bumper crop. Villagers heard the blast and noticed the gray rain, and continued working. The next day, soldiers in protective jumpsuits arrived and instructed farmers to bury their crops in pits. Children, women, and men all undertook this task with bare hands and often bare feet. The children became the first children to serve as liquidators of a nuclear disaster. Radiation monitors followed. They measured fields, homes, animals, bodies, and found all of it contaminated. The bellies of children registered 40 to 50 microroentgen a second. In several villages that recorded 400 microroentgens a second, the levels were high enough to get a life-threatening dose in a month. 3 of the most contaminated villages were evacuated in the following 10 days. By the end of 1958, soldiers resettled 4 more villages and planned to resettle more, but because the costs of rebuilding villages were high, they set up a brokerage system whereby monitors purchased and destroyed produce that registered above a threshold. Villagers that were not resettled have been trying with little success since the early 2000s to win lawsuits against the Russian government for damages for what they claim are increased rates of disease, birth defects, and cancers in the region because of their exposures. Abroad, American intelligence got wind of the disaster, and in 1979 the Zhores Medvedev, a Russian dissident and biologist, published a book about the disaster in the United States, and it became known as the Kyshtym disaster, named after a nearby village, the only population point on published maps. The closed city of Kyshtym, 40, now called Ozersk, only appeared on maps in 1989. Medvedev's book was the first public mention of the cloistered city. In the aftermath of the disaster, Soviet officials created a research station in the East Urals radioactive trace, the world's first outdoor radioecology laboratory. Scientists studied how to clean soils of radioactive elements and produce clean enough for human consumption as a way to learn how to survive nuclear war. This research proved valuable 30 years later for a different reason, when the Chernobyl nuclear power plant exploded in April 1986 and contaminated large portions of Belarus, Ukraine, and Western Russia. At 4 a.m. on March 28, 1979, one of the worst accidents in the history of the U.S. nuclear power industry begins when a pressure valve in the Unit 2 reactor at 3 Mile Island fails to close. Cooling water, contaminated with radiation, drained from the open valve into adjoining buildings, and the core began to dangerously overheat. The 3 Mile Island nuclear power plant was built in 1974 on a sandbar on Pennsylvania's Susquehanna River, just 10 miles downstream from the state capital in Harrisburg. In 1978, a second state-of-the-art reactor began operating on 3 Mile Island, which was lauded for generating affordable and reliable energy in a time of energy crises. After the cooling water began to drain out of the broken pressure valve on the morning of March 28, 1979, emergency cooling pumps automatically went into operation. Left alone, these safety devices would have prevented the development of a larger crisis. However, human operators in the control room misread confusing and contradictory readings and shut off the emergency water system. The reactor was also shut down, but residual heat from the fission process was still being released. By early morning, the core had heated to over 4,000 degrees, just 1,000 degrees short of meltdown. In the meltdown scenario, the core melts, and deadly radiation drifts across the countryside, fatally sickening a potentially great number of people. As the plant operators struggled to understand what had happened, the contaminated water was releasing radioactive gases throughout the plant. The radiation levels, though not immediately life-threatening, were dangerous, and the core cooked further as the contaminated water was contained and precautions were taken to protect the operators. Shortly after 8 a.m., word of the accident leaked to the outside world. The plant's parent company, Metropolitan Edison, downplayed the crisis and claimed that no radiation had been detected off plant grounds, but the same day inspectors detected slightly increased levels of radiation nearby as a result of the contaminated water leak. Pennsylvania Governor Dick Thornburgh considered calling an evacuation. Finally, at about 8 p.m., plant operators realized they needed to get water moving through the core again and restarted the pumps. The temperature began to drop, and pressure in the reactor was reduced. The reactor had come within less than an hour of a complete meltdown. More than half the core was destroyed or molten, but it had not broken its protective shell, and no radiation was escaping. The crisis was apparently over. 2 days later, however, on March 30th, a bubble of highly flammable hydrogen gas was discovered within the reactor building. The bubble of gas was created 2 days before when exposed core materials reacted with superheated steam. On March 28th, some of this gas had exploded, releasing a small amount of radiation into the atmosphere. At that time, plant operators had not registered the explosion, which sounded like a ventilation door closing. After the radiation leak was discovered on March 30th, residents were advised to stay indoors. Experts were uncertain if the hydrogen bubble would create further meltdown or possibly a giant explosion, and as a precaution Governor Thornburgh advised pregnant women and preschool-age children to leave the area within a 5-mile radius of the 3-Mile Island facility until further notice. This led to the panic the governor had hoped to avoid. Within days, more than 100,000 people had fled surrounding towns. On April 1st, President Jimmy Carter arrived at 3-Mile Island to inspect the plant. Carter, a trained nuclear engineer, had helped dismantle a damaged Canadian nuclear reactor while serving in the U.S. Navy. His visit achieved its aim of calming local residents and the nation. That afternoon, experts agreed that the hydrogen bubble was not in danger of exploding. Slowly, the hydrogen was bled from the system as the reactor cooled. At the height of the crisis, plant workers were exposed to unhealthy levels of radiation, but no one outside 3-Mile Island had their health adversely affected by the accident and no one died as a result of the accident. Nonetheless, the incident greatly eroded the public's faith in nuclear power. The unharmed Unit 1 reactor at 3-Mile Island, which was shut down during the crisis, did not resume operation until 1985. Cleanup continued on Unit 2 until 1990, but it was too damaged to be rendered usable again. In the mid-1940s, the United Kingdom government designed a policy that authorized Great Britain to independently develop nuclear weapons. Between 1947 and 1951, 2 nuclear reactors, called the Windscale piles, were built at Windscale Works, located on the Cumbrian coast of northwest England. These reactors were chiefly built to produce Pu-239, but were also used to generate other nuclides such as Pa-210, tritium, Th-232, Np-237, and Co-59. Each of the reactors had graphite moderators, weighing 2,000 metric tons, and were fueled by 180 metric tons of uranium metal. In 1952, the completed Windscale piles were tested, and proved to be successful in extracting the plutonium necessary for the UK's first nuclear weapons test. In October of 1957, the UK faced its worst nuclear power accident in history. The accident ranked a high level of 5 on the International Nuclear Event Scale. It all started with a routine annealing process that was carried out to regulate the levels of Wigner energy stored in the graphite moderators. Wigner energy gathered because of the displacement of carbon atoms from their original positions in the lattice, and this energy needed to be regularly annealed through a heating process that released the energy. On October 7, this process was undertaken in Pile 1, where Wigner energy was to be slowly released until the temperature of the uranium reached 250 degrees Celsius. By the next day, however, the temperature wasn't high enough. This led the operators to re-attempt the annealing process. The following day, on October 9, the temperature was at an alarming 400 degrees Celsius, marking the highest temperature the reactor ever reached. In the following 2 days, fans failed to cool down the pile, fuel cartridges were found to be incredibly hot, and flames were discovered at the back of the pile. On October 11, numerous efforts were taken to extinguish the fire. At 4:30 a.m., carbon dioxide was pumped into the pile, and this proved to be ineffective. At 8:55, water was turned on, changing from an initial water flow of 300 gallons per minute to 800 gallons per minute to 1,000 gallons a minute at 12 p.m. The water flow continued until the next day, when the reactor finally cooled down to a stable temperature. Following the fire, the British government downplayed the severity of the accident. British nuclear physicist Sir William Penney's report on the incident, which was censored, blamed the staff rather than the plant's structures and operations themselves. Harold Macmillan, then Prime Minister of the UK, mandated that only the summary of the report be published, and it wasn't until 30 years following the catastrophe that the full report was made available. The wind scale piles closed for good, and an investigation by Sir Alexander Fleck prompted the 1971 creation of the National Radiological Protection Board.